Hey friends, welcome back to the table and the collective's conversation, where we're having conversations at the intersection of faith and life. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. It helps us reach more people with these great episodes. Today we welcome Hal Donaldson from Convoy of Hope. Maybe you're familiar with Convoy. They're a key disaster relief organization. They're helping feed the world and doing incredible things all over the map. We sit down and talk about what really matters and how Convoy started. You're going to love this conversation. So without any delay, let's get to our conversation with Hal. Friends, welcome back to the Collective's Conversations podcast, where we have conversations at the intersection of faith and life. Today's guest is Hal Donaldson, the CEO and president of Convoy of Hope. Maybe you've heard of Convoy, or maybe they've helped your neighborhood or community. Convoy has a driving passion to feed the world through children's feeding initiatives, community outreach, disaster response, and all kinds of amazing things they do. Hal is also the author of his most recent book, What Really Matters: How to Take Care of Yourself and Serve a Hurting World. Hal, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate you having me very much.
No problem. It's really an honor. I got to tour your facility, not the office space you guys built, but the warehouse, I think 2 years ago with the Tennessee Ministry Network. I'm part of the Assemblies of God, and that place is massive. I mean, there was everything in there. How many square feet is it now?
Yeah. It's about 450,000. Yeah.
450,000
And
square feet.
yeah, you need to come and see us again.
Yeah, because you just built an office complex as well, right?
We did. Yeah. It's and they're connected, and yeah, there's about 450,000 square feet, and we've got other buildings planned, and God just continues to multiply our reach, and so we're looking at adding some other facilities.
Fantastic! You guys do such an amazing work, and it feels like, and maybe this isn't true, but maybe my perception, whenever there's disaster, whenever there's a situation, Convoy seems to be the first ones there. So I got to know how in the size of it, and you have 450,000 square feet, you have teams that travel all over the world. How did it all get started? Like how did you go from, I think it was groceries out of your back of your truck, to this disaster relief organization that you have now?
Well, to really give God the glory for what he's done, I have to go back to a tragedy in my family that took place when I was 12 years of age. My father and mother were on their way to a business meeting, and they were hit by a drunken driver. And my dad was killed instantly. My mother was seriously injured, will be in the hospital for a number of months with many broken bones and internal injuries. But my parents didn't have insurance, Jeff. And so our family was forced to survive on welfare. And we really made it in large part because of the generosity of people in our local church. And so, I think God put in me at a very young age the power of kindness. I experienced the shame of poverty, but I also experienced the power of kindness. But what happens when you are raised poor is you begin a quest not to be poor anymore. And that was certainly the journey I was on. And I went and earned several degrees thinking that would help me escape poverty. And I was about 28, 29 years of age when I was invited to write a book for some missionaries in Calcutta, India. And when I arrived, they told me they wanted me to interview Mother Teresa for their book.
Wow.
And so here I am in a conversation with Mother Teresa, and she stops and she says, "Young man, let me ask you a question. What are you doing to help the poor and the suffering?" And I figured I better not lie to her. I told her the truth. I said, "I'm really not doing much of anything." And she said, "Well, everyone can do something. Just do the next kind thing that God puts in front of you." And those words were haunting for me. I came back to the States, and I began praying. I said, "God, change my priorities, change me." And I was praying one day, and I felt like God dropped in my lap the names of 8 cities to go and live in the streets of 8 cities for 3 days and 3 nights. So I went to Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, D.C., New York, major cities, and I just walked the streets after midnight with a hidden tape recorder, interviewing drug addicts and gang members, prostitutes, runaways, and the homeless. And I rode with the police on the midnight shift in each of those cities. And all I could tell you is that God broke my heart, and I came back from those trips, and I had to do something. And I loaded up a pickup truck with $300 worth of groceries and started passing them out to the working poor. And that was the beginning of Convoy of Hope 30 years ago, out of the back of a pickup truck. And I just like to say that I believe it was God's idea. I simply raised my hand and said, God, I'll try. Yeah. And he has blessed it time and again.
Hal, I want to unpack that a little bit because I know our friends, and I'm as guilty as anybody, goes on a mission trip. They go to something where God incredibly impacts them. They come home full of zeal to do something, and we do it once, or maybe we do it for a week. What was it in you, or what was God stirring in you that goes, this is your lifelong ambition or mission to go and do this? How did that shift? Because you got the degrees, you obviously were writing and doing some other things, but what did God drop in you in that moment that said, this is it, chase after that?
Yeah, I think, that first day, that first $300 worth of groceries, looking into the eyes of desperate, hurting people, that changed me. When I was in Calcutta, the missionaries I was with, for several weeks, all they did is they wanted me to serve in the feeding lines. I looked into the eyes of thousands of people. That feeding line was 15 to 20,000 people every day. And when you look into the eyes of hurting people, it does something to you. And when I gave out that $300 worth of groceries, I felt alive. I felt like I'm closer to God than I've ever been. And so, if that felt so good, why don't I try it again? And so I began gathering my friends and family members, and I pulled them into the circle. Let's do it together. And it grew from pickup trucks to box trucks to semi trucks to warehouses across the world. It just, God chose to smile on it. But it began with God doing a work in my heart. And I like to say that I believe God had to do a work in my heart before he could do a work through my hands. And that's certainly the story of Convoy.
So Convoy is amazing, and I will probably say that 30 times or more in the course of this podcast. They do such amazing things, but you guys show up in some of the worst situations and moments, whether it be poverty or disaster. It's really some of the most difficult of circumstances. You're among the hungry, the poor. As you sort of live there, and how have you sort of faced that head on? And how does that wear on your soul and on yourself? Because I would imagine, we talk about Mother Teresa, and she was with the poor all the time. At some point, that has to fatigue you. How has this task, it invigorates you, like you said, but how has it fatigued you on the other side of that?
It's easy to become overwhelmed by the magnitude of the need, and you can almost be paralyzed by the need. You see it everywhere. And you can begin to tell yourself, well, I can't do everything, so I'm going to do nothing. But doing something is always better than doing nothing. And when you study the life of Jesus in the Gospels, you see that Jesus didn't heal everyone. He didn't feed everyone. He didn't meet every need. But he did what his Father asked him to do. And that's why prayer is such an important component to compassion ministry. You have to know that what you're doing is something that God is asking you to do. A lot of times people are doing amazing things, they're doing great things, but God isn't necessarily asking them to do it. And that certainly, I think, was something that I learned early on, is that people would tell me, Hal, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. And I probably was, to be honest with you. But I think as my prayer life caught up with my compassion life, I think I became a lot more strategic. And, I would pray this prayer when I would see a need. Jesus, do you want to love them through me? Because when you understand that all you are is a channel of Christ's blessing to the poor and the suffering, when you understand that, your job is just to keep the channel open and to keep that dialogue open with Jesus so that you know when he's asking you to help someone who's in need.
Yeah. So how have you discerned that, Hal, that distinction between God and good? I mean, there's lots of good things we can do, but you're saying that you're really trusting the leading of the Spirit on that. How have you been able to
Yeah.
discern the distinction?
Well, I think first you have to have an inclination to meet needs. I think a lot of times we talk ourselves out of it. So I think our first step needs to be, we're going to meet that need. But it's okay to stop and to give God a vote and to say, is this something you're wanting me to do? There have been times that I've seen people who are desperate in need, and my first inclination is to help them, but I have felt a real stop. People have said, well, how do you hear God's voice? And for me, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but for me, it's this sudden clarity. It's like blue sky, like this is something I'm supposed to do. And then other times, it's almost like a dark cloud, like, no, don't do that. Maybe it's danger. Maybe it's someone else who's supposed to meet that need, whatever the case. For me, it's clarity or darkness. That's how I really discern God's will.
Yeah, that's great. And it's I think it's helpful to all of us. I want to talk about your book, What Really Matters, How to Take Care of Yourself and Serve a Hurting World, because I think that's an important message. Why do you think now was the time for that message in your ministry to come out? I mean, obviously, maybe there's some lessons learned, but why this book? Why now?
Convoy of Hope is I think the 35th largest charity in the United States out of 1.5 million charities. Wow. We're number 35 according to Forbes. And, as Convoy began to creep up that list, I was getting a barrage of requests, inquiries from everything from pastors, business leaders, organizational leaders. I mean, a barrage. How did you do it? What's the secret sauce? And invariably, I would say, well, it actually begins with you as the leader. If you get healthy, if you're healthy spiritually, emotionally, physically, you're giving God a foundation to build upon. If you're not healthy, then your foundation is flawed, and God will only build so tall and so high. And so I would tell leaders this, and they would say, well, I get that, but what is the secret sauce? What are the organizational adjustments that I need to make? And I said, it doesn't begin with the adjustments. It begins with you as a leader. And so I thought, well, maybe it's time for me just to put it in writing. And so instead of fielding all these calls and inquiries, I just send them a book with really a lot of stories and examples of what I've learned. And so that's really the reason we wrote it now.
Yeah. So, I mean, in healthy, I love that, but it feels like a moving target for different people. So what is healthy? How do we achieve it? What is healthy for Hal even? What has been maybe adjustments you've made in your life to be healthy as a leader for Convoy and for your family?
Yeah, I have to be intentional. I'll tell you what, for many years I wasn't. And my family was making sacrifices. I was making sacrifices that God didn't ask me to make. I was traveling around the world doing great things, meeting needs. But meanwhile, my family was having to suffer without me. I was away from home 150 nights to 200 nights a year. Again, doing wonderful things, but making sacrifices that God wasn't asking me to make. And, it was really the grace of God that really, I think, prevented me from having issues in my family. I have an amazing wife. She's a superstar. I have 4 incredible kids, but it was the grace of God. But here's what happened at age 50, Jeff. I found myself in the hospital operating room, operating on my heart. And they had to put a stent in my heart. And as I was recovering in the hospital, I really felt like God made it very clear to me that I was trying to do too much. And when I was discharged from the hospital, I stepped down from 2 of my jobs. I had 2 book writing contracts that I just said I can't do it. I resigned from 8 boards. I was trying to do too much. And I felt like God was telling me that you need to focus on Convoy of Hope and focus on your family. That's what I've called you to do. And when I made that decision, it's ironic, but that's when Convoy of Hope began to soar to new heights. When I moved from what I would say self-reliance to God-reliance, God did things I never could. And in the early days, I tried to work 125%. I did, because I thought that was pleasing God. And I thought that because of the nature of the work that I was doing, the mission, if you will, that I was inoculated from the decisions and from poor decisions. And I later learned there in that hospital, that's not the case. There are consequences to poor decisions, trying to do too much. So I think that's the journey I've been on. But at age 50, everything changed.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do we help our friends maybe who are listening who, before they end up on a hospital bed, before they end up in surgery, before they have a major wake-up moment like that, to really find the lane God wants them to run in, like you said with Convoy? Because I think we can all do good things. We can all do, especially in the kingdom of God, there's something to do always. Is it, right. Maybe my question is this, is it the same? Is it the clarity in the dark cloud that we kind of look and go, where does God want us to kind of hone in our focus? Help our friends kind of understand what they can do to maybe take some practical steps.
Yeah, and really that's what the book is mostly is really practical steps people can take. I'll just share 3 that I took, and I took many to change the course of my life. But one, for example, was that I decided after 8 o'clock every night, I'm not going to try and solve problems or deal with difficult issues. Because here's what happens. 8 o'clock goes to 10 o'clock to midnight, and you find yourself lying awake in bed at 2 a.m. trying to solve a problem. And what you're really doing is you're losing sleep, and you're stealing from tomorrow. Allow problems to segue to tomorrow. And that was one of the steps I took. Secondly, is I used to do take meetings, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I eliminated dinner meetings because that was my family time. It was my wife's time, my kids' time. And so I would do breakfast and lunch, but not dinner. And even today, I rarely will take a dinner meeting. And then another thing that I did was I made vacation sacred. At the beginning of the year, my wife and I and our kids, we would take a year-long calendar and we would mark off vacation time, rest time, and we would make it sacred. I remember during one vacation, I was invited to the Oval Office with 5 other leaders, and I declined because it was during a vacation. And that was my family times. It was my promise, my pledge to those girls that I was going to be with them.
Yeah.
And nothing was going to interfere. Those are some of the steps that I took that I believe really were transformational.
Yeah.
And the book is filled with those kind of ideas that will help people set new priorities.
Yeah. What I've learned about myself, Hal, and maybe you can speak to this as well for you, vacation for me starts about day 3 because I feel like my mind and my soul are still caught up in whatever was happening in the busyness and the business of what it was. That vacation, like a long weekend, isn't really restful because it's not till about day 3 that my body and my mind shut down. Have you found that to be true as well?
That's right. Yeah, but
So,
I think I'm probably a weekend. It probably takes me a week to turn it off.
I think Craig Groeschel said, I think I heard him say he takes a 2-week vacation because it takes him the whole first week to really unwind. And I just think that's incredibly true for especially people running at such a high pace and people doing such incredible work like you, that it takes a minute for the mind and the body to really begin to relax on a vacation or anything like that. How do you, and I like this idea of shutting things down at 8 o'clock, but for our friends who can physically turn the phone off but can't turn their mind off, how have you maybe learned to control the thought life of the busyness of the problem that can steal sleep?
I've been asked that before, and I believe it's a gift. It's a gift from God. it's very difficult to do without his help. And, so I would encourage people, begin praying that God gives you an 8 p.m. alarm bell in your head and in your heart. I don't know that there's any mental gymnastics that can do it. I think it's a gift from God.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be praying for that because I need some more sleep, Hal. Like sometimes the problems show up and they just keep going. I can turn them off like physically, but they're still mentally being processed. A very common conversation on leaders in the church and outside the church is this idea of burnout. We see leaders all the time who just are fatiguing themselves to ends, and then bad decisions are made, or just they can't sustain or can't go on. I think COVID, especially in the ministry realm, we saw pastors at a record pace leaving churches because of what was asked of them. What are some of the indicators early on of burnout so our friends who maybe they're listening, whether they're in ministry or not, can go, hey, I can check these off and see that burnout's coming? What are some of the indicators that you saw or maybe that you're sharing with leaders as you walk through this?
Yeah, I think most people who are near burnout or experiencing burnout don't recognize it. It's the people around them, their families, who recognize it first. And that's why it's so important that as leaders, we surround ourselves with the right people who can talk straight to us. A lot of times leaders surround themselves with people who are what I would call opportunists. They're close to you because they're trying to get something from you rather than give something to you. And I think it's important we surround ourselves with people who are truth tellers. Mm-hmm. They tell us the truth because they'll identify it long before, someone who's driven, someone who's ambitious, someone who's trying to be successful. They'll acknowledge it first, but a lot of times they won't tell you. And I think it's important, whether it's your spouse, your children, your coworkers, you're surrounded by people who tell you the truth. And I'm not going to play psychiatrist or psychologist, but I think it's not getting enough sleep, not exercising, not eating right, shortchanging your devotional life is a big one. Stop reading the Word, stop praying, stop ministering to other people. Those are all indicators that something is out of whack.
Yeah, that's good. That's good advice. I know, especially for pastors, and I've been in pastoral ministry for a while, when I don't have a devotional life and it's only sermon preparatory life, like when I'm kind of combining the two, I'm like, oh, I'm spending so much time in the Word doing message prep, but I quit doing the actual personal time. I know that's an indicator for me. And so a couple of years ago, I made the decision that whatever I was studying for sermons, I would be on the far other side of the Bible for personal things, so that as much as I could, they wouldn't connect. So if I'm teaching on Moses, I'm reading something in the New Testament, in the Gospels maybe, so that I'm not looking at my personal devotion through a lens of like, oh, I can preach this next Sunday or whatever. So that I had some personal time with the Lord where I wasn't pastor, but I was just Jeff. So for me, that's been a step that I took. So I wouldn't like try to connect the two and be like, hey, I'm doing sermon prep and devotions, which is never really a devotion. So,
that makes sense.
So, but so like, how did you respond? I know you were at the point of burnout, or the book, you were kind of walking through that. What was the response? We talked about a little bit some of the decisions you made, but what was the response to that, and how did you get healthy personally through that?
Yeah, I became very intentional. A lot of people can talk about the fact they want to get healthy, but they don't take the steps necessary. And, I guess I'm fortunate that my hospital stay scared me enough that I began to make the changes. And, I kind of harken back to an interview I did years and years ago when I was working as a journalist. I interviewed Ted Turner, who is the famed media mogul who created CNN. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Turner, so what's the key to your success? And he responded, leisure time. And those words came back to me in the hospital. And I realized that I needed more leisure time in order to really accomplish more for God. I know that's counterintuitive, but that's really what I began to do. I began to spend a little bit more time having fun. And as I did, I would come to work with a lot more energy. And I think my effectiveness went to a whole new level when I began really enjoying life a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that feels paradoxical to a lot of us, that taking time off makes you more effective and efficient. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like, if you have energy to bring to the table or bring to the job, then you're probably going to be more accomplished in what you do than if you're tired all the time or you're fatigued all the time.
That's exactly right.
I think what we're doing is maybe we're not doctors, but we're telling our friends maybe you should probably take a vacation. I think that's the end all be all. If we had one statement from today's conversation, go on vacation, guys. You should need to go. My wife and I just took a cruise,
that's right.
And that was probably we had a hard season, and it was like we were one of the afternoons at sea, and we're up on the top deck. And I took a Johnny Cash biography that I was reading, and like I fell asleep for like an hour and a half, and I never take naps. And I was like, that's an indication that I was probably more tired than I realized. That I was finally able to unwind and relax and then come back with energy. For those of our friends who maybe think burnout is just inevitable and healing's not possible, what could you say to our friends who are maybe walking the edge and they think, well, Hal, you don't know. I got all this to do. I got all this kingdom work to do, or I got all this to do. What could you say to our friends who are like pushing that edge and won't relent, but need to maybe rest?
I think they need to be honest with themselves, honest with God, honest with their close friends and family. It begins with honesty. I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we so driven? And a lot of times we're driven because we are living up to other people's expectations, or we have what I would call reckless ambition. Maybe as a young person, we idolize someone who had achieved a lot, and we are trying to live up to their example. I think a lot of times, especially as a young person, we tend to idolize and emulate people who are the most visible, the loudest, who have the biggest ministry. When I was in my 20s, I wish I had looked up to the people who were the most humble and the most faithful. But I think it really comes down to being honest with yourself. It's why are you experiencing burnout? It's probably because you're trying to do too much or you're resting too little. It's one of the two.
Yeah.
And I would just encourage people to be honest with themselves because that's where it all starts.
I think that's important. I think what you're saying is really critical, because I think we can excuse a lot of things, especially in the church, as needed and necessary because it's God's work. And like you're saying that the intentionality, and you started reclaiming vacations and rest days and time with your family. I think it's really easy for us to dismiss the things around us because we're saying, well, it's the kingdom of God, it needs done. But we look scripturally, and there's oftentimes Jesus pulled away and rested. Like we forget that part of Jesus. And in 3 years, when he had this very small window to work in, he took a lot of naps. And I think there's something important that we can take with that to go, if we're going to run at our best, we got to have the energy to run. And Convoy has definitely been something that's ran at its best for a long time. I wanted to ask you personally, now I'll tell you where this question came from. I was on a podcast recently as a guest. It's a podcast about ministries through podcasts. It's a great, great listen. And the host asked me, what ministry or church or minister that could I think of that didn't have a podcast that I would want to have a podcast? And after some time, I thought I would love if Convoy of Hope had a From the Field podcast. This would be awesome. This would be great. Where you show up, and in the midst of disaster, you're recording these stories and hearing what God's doing. So if we had a Convoy of Hope in the midst of the field podcast, Hal, what would be a story you would tell us on that podcast?
Jeff, I lost you there for a moment. I think you were saying that Convoy of Hope should have its own podcast.
I did. Let me finish the question again. So if Convoy of Hope had a podcast where you were kind of telling stories from the field, from these moments of disaster or wherever you show up, what would be maybe a story you would share on that podcast? What's a story that has stuck with you over the years?
Yeah, there would be so many. One I would share that maybe wasn't related directly to a disaster, but it was in Africa right now. It's the greatest hunger crisis the world has seen in 50 years. And I was in Ethiopia, and it was our women's empowerment program, and about 400 women were graduating that day. We had trained them. They were starting their own businesses that we had helped them with. And one after the other got up and shared their story. And after the program was over, one young woman came up to me and she said, you can't leave until you hear my story. Mm-hmm. At age 13, she was raped and she got AIDS. Later, she came down with leprosy, and her husband left her with 3 small children, and she found herself living in the streets of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And it was there that one of our workers found her. And so when she met me, she planted a kiss on my cheek and she said, now I own my own business. I'm feeding my own kids and I have my own place to live. And my life has completely turned around because now I know Jesus. Mm-hmm. And just as she had kissed me, I noticed that the dress she was wearing was somewhat soiled. It was old. And just as she did that, there was another woman that walked right behind her, and she happened to be carrying like a brand new white dress. And without even knowing if it would fit this young woman, I bought that dress. I said, ma'am, is that dress for sale? And she said, yes, it is. And I bought that dress. And I have to tell you, that dress fit this young woman perfectly. Wow. God was so concerned about this woman's dress and her attire that he provided a dress. That's just one that stands out to me because I have recently toured Africa and seen the desperate need. I mean, some of these women have walked 10 miles, no exaggeration, 10 miles just to receive the food that Convoy of Hope was going to provide and the clean drinking water for their children. It's so underreported. I know, Jeff, you don't want to go down this road, but
I'm open to it.
It's so underreported. It's so underreported because everyone is so focused on the political scene and the entertainment scene, but literally millions of people are at risk on the African continent right now. And I just don't believe that as believers we should take that sitting down.
Right. I agree. How can we, and I know we were talking about your book, but how can we respond? I know Convoy's responding, but how can the church respond to this need? One, I think we need to wake up to it, but two, how can we just respond? What can we do?
I think there's several things. Obviously, you could pray, and we should pray. Secondly, I think if you have an existing relationship with someone on the African continent, they can tell you about the need because it's dire. Third is they can trust the work of Convoy of Hope because we are on a quest to feed 1 million children every day, not just in Africa, but other parts of the world. But Africa is getting a lot of our attention. And if it's something that you're interested in, you want to feed children and help mothers feed their own children, help farmers increase their yields, they can go to convoyofhope.org and they can trust us. We'll get the job done. We are getting the job done.
Yeah, you guys are doing some great things around the world, and it sounds like you're doing great things there in Africa. And I just appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, sharing the need in Africa. Hal, as we wrap up, I have one final question I ask every guest that comes on the show. Since the show is titled The Collective's Conversation, it sounds like you've had many conversations with many important people, but I'm going to ask one more time. Who is one person, historical, present day, fictional, or in your real life that you would want to sit down and have a conversation with?
I'm sure, Jeff, on your podcast, someone has used this name before, but when I've been asked this question, I've always responded with Martin Luther King, but probably for a different reason than most people would. My reason for Martin Luther King is that he led a peace movement. He led change. And I kind of feel like Convoy of Hope is trying to lead a very similar thing. We are not really about building Convoy of Hope as much as we are being a catalyst for a compassion movement across the United States. And so I would love to sit down with Martin Luther King and just ask him questions about how do you become a catalyst and a spark for a national movement? How do you mobilize the masses, not only in peace, but in kindness and compassion? That's probably what I would love to talk to him about.
Yeah, that's a great guess. Nobody's ever said that, Hal, so I'm glad you brought that up, that Dr. King would be a great option. I mean, we've had the gamut. That's a great response. The book is What Really Matters, How to Take Care of Yourself and Serve a Hurting World. I think you have about 30 other books, so pick up any one of Hal's books. I'm sure Amazon is full of them. Go to the Convoy of Hope. Was it .org? Is that correct? Convoyofhope.org.
Yes.
Find out what they're doing in Africa.
Yes.
You can partner with them financially. You can also, I know several churches have brought trucks of food into their community through you guys to give away.
Very much.
You can look at that option. There's lots of things. Just go there and see how you can help or how they can help you. And just love what you're doing. Hal, as we always say here at the Collective's Conversation, you've got a seat at the table. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me. Really grateful.
Wow, what a great conversation that was. Thanks for joining us in the conversation. If something from the conversation really stood out to you, would you share it and tag me on social media at Jeff_Pitts_ on Instagram? And we would love it if you would rate and review and subscribe to the show. That just helps us reach more people with these great conversations. And as we always say, you've got a seat at the table. Thanks for joining the conversation.